In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where ancient empires span countless star systems and alien civilizations have ruled for millennia, there exists a truth that haunts the nightmares of every sentient species. When the sun sets and darkness falls across their worlds, when their mighty fleets return to port and their warriors lay down their weapons, when their children whisper fearfully in their beds about the monsters that lurk in the void between stars, there is only one species they call upon for protection. Humans. The galaxy's youngest race. The upstarts who stumbled into space barely 3 centuries ago. The primitives who still tell stories around fires and believe in guardian angels. Yet when the Zephyrian Queen, ruler of 1,000 worlds and commander of fleets that could shatter planets, trembles before an ancient evil that has awakened from eons of slumber, she finds herself asking the question that defines our age: who protects you after dark? And, when her own daughter, Princess Lyralii, answers with a name that should mean nothing to such an advanced civilization, the Queen realizes that perhaps the humans were never the primitives after all. Perhaps they were exactly what the galaxy had been waiting for: protectors who understood that true strength isn't found in technology or ancient wisdom, but in the simple, terrifying willingness to stand between the innocent and the dark. This is the story of how humanity earned its place not as conquerors or explorers, but as the galaxy's guardians. And it begins on the night when something very old and very hungry decided it was time to feed again. Queen Zerathia stood at the observation deck of her flagship, the Eternal Dominion, watching the sun set over Zephyr Prime for what she feared might be the last time. The massive dreadnought hung in orbit above her homeworld, its crystalline hull reflecting the dying light in patterns that had once seemed beautiful to her. Now, they reminded her too much of the strange geometries that had been appearing in her nightmares. The Queen was old by any standard, even by Zephyrian measurements. Her species lived for over 2,000 years, and she had ruled for 8 centuries of those. She had seen the rise and fall of dozens of smaller empires, had commanded fleets in wars that reshaped the galaxy's political landscape, and had negotiated treaties that brought peace to systems that had known only conflict for generations. But nothing in her vast experience had prepared her for the reports that had been flooding in from the Outer Rim territories. Ships disappearing without trace. Entire colonies found empty, their populations simply gone. Strange signals from dead space that hurt to listen to. And, always, the survivors spoke of something moving in the darkness between stars, something that turned grown warriors into gibbering children and made the bravest souls weep with terror at the mere memory. "Your Majesty," came a voice behind her. She turned to see Admiral Vorthak, her chief military advisor, approaching with the careful gait of someone bearing terrible news. His forearms hung at his sides in the posture their species used to convey deep respect and deeper worry. "More reports?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. 3 more systems have gone dark in the last solar cycle. The blazing corona, the starfire, and the eternal glory were all lost with all hands while investigating the Kepler Nebula anomalies. That brings our total losses to 47 ships and over 2 million souls. Zerathia closed her eyes. Each ship represented the finest of Zephyrian military engineering, crewed by warriors who had proven themselves in countless battles. The eternal glory alone had carried enough firepower to reduce a planet to ash. Whatever was out there wasn't just dangerous, it was beyond their understanding. And the other powers? The Altarian Federation? The crystalline hegemony? Similar losses, Majesty. The Altarians have recalled their entire deep space fleet to defend their core worlds. The crystalline hegemony has activated their planetary defense networks for the first time in 3 centuries. The Korvaxi Empire has even reopened their ancient fortress worlds that haven't been manned since the Void Wars. The Void Wars. That was a name that sent chills through any student of galactic history. 5,000 years ago, something had emerged from the deep dark and nearly consumed all sentient life in the galaxy. The records from that time were incomplete, fragmented, many destroyed deliberately by those who survived. What little remained spoke of entities that existed partially outside normal spacetime, that fed on suffering and fear, that turned entire star systems into charnel houses before vanishing back into the void. Most historians believed the Void Wars were myth, exaggerated tales from primitive civilizations trying to explain natural disasters or the collapse of overextended empires. But, standing here, watching the fear spread across her kingdom like a plague, Zerathia was beginning to suspect those historians were very, very wrong. "Majesty," Admiral Vorthak continued, "there's something else.
Princess Lyralii has requested an audience. The queen's expression softened slightly. Her daughter was the joy of her long life, brilliant and compassionate in ways that gave Zerathia hope for the future of their people. At barely 200 years old, Lyralii was still considered young by their standards, but she possessed a wisdom that often surprised even the queen. "Send her in," Zerathia said. Princess Lyralii entered the observation deck with the fluid grace that marked all members of the royal bloodline. Her crystalline features caught the last rays of the setting sun, and, for a moment, she looked like a sculpture carved from living light. But the queen could see the worry in her daughter's multifaceted eyes. "Mother," Lyralii said, offering the traditional gesture of respect before moving to stand beside the queen at the viewport. "I've been monitoring the transmissions from the affected systems. The pattern is clear. Whatever this is, it's moving toward the core worlds. Toward us. I know, my daughter. That's why I've ordered the mobilization of the Grand Fleet. Every ship, every warrior we can muster." Lyralii was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars begin to appear as darkness fell over their world. "Mother, may I speak freely?" "Always. Our fleets won't be enough. The Eltarians had the most advanced military in this sector of the galaxy, and they've been swept aside like leaves in a storm. The crystalline hegemony's technology is built on principles we can barely comprehend, and they're terrified. Whatever we're facing, conventional warfare isn't the answer." Queen Zerathia felt a cold weight settle in her chest. "Then, what do you suggest?" "I've been researching the old records, the fragments that survived from the Void Wars. There are references to something they called the Night Guard. Warriors from a young species who stood against the darkness when all others failed. Lyralii, those are myths. Stories told by primitive civilizations." "Are they?" The princess turned to face her mother directly. 3 days ago, I received a transmission from the human colony on Kepler 442b. They reported strange signals from dead space, the same kind that preceded the attacks on the other systems. "That was 3 days ago, Mother. The colony should have gone dark by now, should have joined the list of missing populations. But they're still there. Still transmitting. Still very much alive." The queen felt something stir in the back of her mind, a memory from decades ago. The humans. Earth's children, as they called themselves. A species barely 3 centuries into their space age, with technology that seemed almost quaint by galactic standards. They had been granted membership in the Galactic Council more out of curiosity than respect, a young race to be observed and gently guided as they found their place among the stars. But there had been incidents. Small things, easily dismissed. Human merchant ships arriving at systems where pirates had been operating, only to find the pirates mysteriously gone. Human colonies thriving in sectors where other species had failed, reporting unusually low crime rates and strange stories about helpful strangers who appeared in times of crisis. Human exploration vessels venturing into regions that veteran spacers avoided, and returning with tales that nobody quite believed. "You're suggesting we contact them?" the queen asked. "I'm suggesting we listen to them," Lyralii replied. 3 hours ago, I intercepted a transmission from the Kepler 442b colony. They weren't calling for help or reporting an attack. They were offering assistance to any ships in the area. "Mother, they're not just surviving out there, they're protecting others." Before the queen could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. The lights on the observation deck shifted to emergency amber as Admiral Vorthak's voice echoed through the comm system. "All hands to battle stations. Unknown contacts emerging from hyperspace. Repeat, unknown contacts emerging from hyperspace." The queen and her daughter rushed to the bridge, where they found organized chaos. Officers moved with practiced efficiency, but Zerathia could see the tension in their movements, the way their voices carried just a hint of barely controlled fear. "Report," the queen commanded as she took her position on the command throne. 18 objects have emerged from hyperspace at the system's edge, Admiral Vorthak said, his forearms dancing over multiple control surfaces. "They don't match any known ship configuration. They're not responding to hails, and..." He paused, his expression grim. "Majesty, our sensors are having difficulty getting consistent readings. The objects seem to phase in and out of normal spacetime.
On the main screen, the tactical display showed the approaching contacts. They moved in a formation that hurt to look at directly, their paths weaving through space in patterns that seemed to follow no known physics. Even watching their movement on the screen made several officers on the bridge look away, their faces pale. Estimated time to engagement, the Queen asked. At their current rate of approach, approximately 6 hours until they reach the inner system. 6 hours. Zerathia closed her eyes and felt the weight of 8 centuries of rule settling on her shoulders. In 6 hours, everything she had built, everything her people had achieved, could be gone. The approaching ships, if they could be called ships, represented something that had already destroyed dozens of civilizations. Majesty, came a new voice from the communications station. We're receiving a transmission. It's from the human colony on Kepler 442b. The Queen felt her heart skip a beat. On screen. The image that appeared showed a human male, middle-aged by their standards, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed oddly calm given the circumstances. He sat in what appeared to be a simple communication booth, nothing fancy or threatening about his appearance. This is Commander Sarah Chen of the Kepler 442b colony, speaking for the human settlements in this sector, the man said. The Queen noted the discrepancy. The speaker was clearly male, but he was speaking for someone named Sarah Chen. Curious. We've detected the approach of hostile entities toward the Zephyr system. We know you don't know us well, and we know our technology probably seems primitive to you, but we're prepared to offer assistance if you'll accept it. Admiral Vortak stepped forward. Majesty, with respect, what could they possibly do that our grand fleet cannot? Before the Queen could respond, Princess Lyrelii moved to the communications console. Commander Chen, this is Princess Lyrelii of the Zephyrian Empire. What kind of assistance are you offering? The human smiled, and there was something in his expression that reminded the Queen of her own warriors before a battle they knew they could win. Your Highness, we're offering to do what we've always done. We're offering to stand between you and the dark. You speak of protection, Admiral Vortak interjected, but you're a single colony world. We have the mightiest fleet in this sector of the galaxy. Admiral, the human replied, his tone remaining respectful but firm, with all due respect to your achievements, fleets and firepower aren't what's needed here. The things approaching your system aren't just ships, they're something older and hungrier. They feed on fear, on despair, on the certainty that nothing can stand against them. But there's one thing they've never learned to digest. And what's that? The Queen found herself asking. The human smile widened, and, for just a moment, Zerathia saw something in his eyes that made her believe in impossible things. Hope, Your Majesty. Stubborn, unreasonable, human hope. And the absolute refusal to let anything hurt the people we've chosen to protect. The transmission cut out, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. In the tactical display, the alien contacts continued their approach, their impossible movements weaving through space like nightmares given form. But, somewhere in the darkness beyond the system's edge, a handful of human ships was moving to intercept them. Queen Zerathia found herself thinking of an old question, one that had been asked by frightened children across the galaxy for generations: who protects you after dark? For the first time in her long life, she thought she might have an answer. As the hours passed and the alien entities drew closer, the Queen received reports from across the galaxy. The same scenario was playing out everywhere, ancient evils emerging from the deep dark, overwhelming the mightiest civilizations with ease. But, in every system where humans were present, no matter how few, no matter how outgunned, the attacks were being turned back. The humans weren't winning through superior technology or greater numbers. They were winning because they had something that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten in their long climb to sophistication: they still believed in heroes. They still believed that sometimes, all it took was someone willing to stand up and say no to the darkness. And, as Queen Zerathia watched the tactical display and waited for the battle to begin, she found herself hoping that her daughter was right. That the myths were true. That somewhere out there in the black, the Night Guard was still keeping watch. Because if they weren't, then, the galaxy was about to learn what it meant to face the darkness alone. The first sign that something had changed in the approaching alien formation came 3 hours before the estimated contact time. The impossibly moving entities suddenly stopped their advance, holding position at the edge of the system's gravity well like predators that had caught an unexpected scent. Admiral, reported the sensor officer,
The hostile contacts have ceased forward movement. They're maintaining position approximately 40 astronomical units from the primary star. Queen Zerathia leaned forward in her command throne. Why would they stop? Before Admiral Vortak could respond, new contacts appeared on the tactical display.
7 small ships, their signatures clearly human in origin, had emerged from hyperspace directly between the alien entities and the inner system. The scale was almost laughable, 7 ships that wouldn't have qualified as corvettes by Zephyrian standards, facing 18 contacts that had already destroyed some of the most powerful fleets in the galaxy.
Magnify the display, the Queen ordered.
The main screen shifted to show the human vessels in detail. They were unlike anything in the standard databases of human ship designs. Where most human craft were built with clean lines and efficient engineering, these ships seemed to have been crafted with an entirely different philosophy. Their hulls bore intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow even as they watched, and each vessel emanated a faint luminescence that didn't match any known technology. "Majesty," Princess Lyralii said from her position at the science station, "the human ships are broadcasting on multiple frequencies."
It's not a standard communication, it's more like a song. A song? Admiral Vortak's expression showed his confusion. In the middle of a battle?
"Put it through the speakers," the Queen commanded. What filled the bridge wasn't music in any conventional sense. It was something deeper, more primal, a sound that seemed to resonate not just in their auditory receptors but in something more fundamental. It spoke of ancient campfires and protective watches, of guardians standing vigil through long nights, of promises made and kept across generations. Most of the bridge crew found themselves standing straighter, feeling courage they hadn't known they possessed.
"What is that?" whispered Admiral Vortak.
"It's a war song," Princess Lyralii said, her voice filled with wonder.
"But
not for themselves.
It's for us.
They're singing to give us courage." On the tactical display, the alien entities began to move again, but their approach was different now. Instead of the confident advance they had shown before, they moved with what could only be described as caution. The patterns they traced through space became more erratic, as if they were encountering resistance they hadn't expected.
"Incoming transmission," announced the communications officer. "It's from the lead human vessel."
The screen shifted to show a human woman this time, middle-aged with silver streaking her dark hair. She wore what appeared to be a simple uniform, but there was something about her bearing that commanded attention. Behind her, the bridge of her ship was visible, cramped by galactic standards, but every surface seemed to glow with the same soft light that emanated from the hull. "This is Commander Sarah Chen of the Night Watch vessel Guardian's Promise," she said. "To all forces in the Zephyr system, we advise you to maintain your current positions. We'll handle the incursion." Admiral Vortak stepped forward. "Commander Chen, with all due respect, you're outnumbered and outgunned.
Our fleet stands ready to assist."
The human commander smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded the Queen of her oldest warriors, the ones who had seen so much combat that battle had become as natural as breathing. "Admiral, I appreciate the offer, but trust me when I say this is what we do. Besides, conventional weapons won't be effective against these entities. They exist partially outside normal spacetime. You need something else to fight them."
"And what's that?" the Queen found herself asking.
"Faith," Commander Chen replied simply. "The absolute certainty that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost.
The knowledge that darkness, no matter how ancient or powerful, is just the absence of light.
And, sometimes, all it takes is one small flame to drive it back." As if summoned by her words, the human ships began to glow brighter. The patterns on their hulls shifted and flowed, forming symbols that hurt to look at directly but filled the observer with a strange sense of safety and hope. The song that had been broadcasting from their vessels grew stronger, more complex, and, across the Zephyrian fleet, crew members found themselves standing taller, facing the approaching threat with courage instead of fear.
"Impossible," breathed the sensor officer. "The alien entities are slowing their approach. Their energy signatures are fluctuating." On the main screen, they could see the truth of it.
The 18 nightmare shapes that had been advancing with predatory confidence were now moving hesitantly, their impossible geometries seeming to waver and blur at the edges. For the first time since the crisis had begun, they looked uncertain.
"How are they doing that?" Admiral Vortak demanded.
Princess Lyralii looked up from her science station, her expression filled with awe.
Mother, the human ships aren't just broadcasting that song. They're using it to alter the fundamental properties of local spacetime. They're creating zones of... I don't know how to describe it.
Zones where hope is literally a physical force. Before the Queen could process the implications of that statement, the battle began. The alien entities moved first, launching something that wasn't quite an attack in any conventional sense. Instead of energy beams or kinetic projectiles, they projected waves of pure despair, psychic assaults designed to break the will of their enemies before the physical battle even began. These were the weapons that had shattered the morale of entire fleets, that had driven brave warriors to madness and surrender. They crashed against the human ships like waves against a seawall. The Night Watch vessels didn't even slow down. If anything, they seemed to grow brighter, their song becoming a harmony that turned the psychic assault back on itself. Where despair touched hope, it didn't just dissipate, it was transformed, becoming fuel for the very courage it had been meant to destroy.
By the eternal light, whispered Admiral Vorthak. They're immune.
Commander Chen's voice came through the speakers, calm and steady despite the battle raging around her ship.
All vessels, this is Guardian's promise. Beginning primary engagement protocol.
Remember, these things feed on fear and doubt.
Don't give them any. The 7 human ships moved with a coordination that defied explanation.
They didn't fight like a fleet, they fought like a single organism with 7 parts, each vessel perfectly positioned to support the others.
Their weapons weren't the energy cannons or particle beams that dominated galactic warfare.
Instead, they fired something that looked like concentrated starlight, beams of pure luminescence that struck the alien entities and made them recoil as if burned.
What kind of weapons are those? The Queen asked. According to our sensors, Princess Lyralii reported, they're not weapons at all.
They're projecting concentrated electromagnetic radiation in frequencies that match stellar emissions, but somehow focused and intensified. It's as if they've learned to wield sunlight itself. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the galactic military databases. The alien entities, so overwhelming against conventional forces, found themselves matched by an enemy that seemed to understand them on a fundamental level. Where they projected fear, the humans answered with courage. Where they created zones of despair, the Night Watch vessels filled them with hope. Where they tried to bend reality to their will, the human ships stood as anchors of normality in the chaos. One of the alien entities managed to break through the defensive formation, its nightmare shape bearing down on the Guardian's promise. The creature, for it was clearly more than a simple ship, opened like a flower of living darkness, revealing rows of what could only be described as teeth made of twisted spacetime.
Commander Chen's voice never wavered.
This is Guardian's promise to all vessels. If we don't make it back, remember that the light never really dies. It just waits for someone brave enough to kindle it again. But, instead of being consumed, something extraordinary happened. The Guardian's promise began to burn not with fire, but with something far more fundamental. Every surface of the ship blazed with the same light that lived at the heart of stars, and that light began to spread, jumping from vessel to vessel among the human fleet until all 7 ships burned like miniature suns. The alien entity that had been about to consume them recoiled as if it had grasped molten metal. Its scream, if something that existed partially outside normal spacetime could be said to scream, resonated across multiple dimensions, a sound of ancient hunger meeting immovable resistance. "They're retreating," reported the sensor officer, his voice filled with disbelief.
"All contacts are withdrawing from the system."
On the main screen, they watched as the 18 nightmare shapes began to fade, not destroyed but driven back to whatever dark dimension they called home. Their retreat wasn't the organized withdrawal of a defeated military force, it was the desperate flight of predators who had encountered something they couldn't digest, something that burned them from the inside out. In moments, they were gone, leaving only the 7 human ships floating in the darkness, their luminescence slowly fading back to normal levels. "Open a channel to the Guardian's promise," the Queen commanded. Commander Chen's face appeared on the screen, and, despite having just faced down entities that had terrorized half the galaxy, she looked remarkably composed.
"Your Majesty.
The immediate threat has been neutralized, but I'm afraid this was just a scouting force.
The real invasion is still coming." "How do you know?" "Because we've been fighting them for longer than you might expect." These entities, the ones your people call the Void Spawn, we've encountered them before. They probe, they test defenses, they learn.
What you just saw was their way of taking our measure.
Admiral Vortak stepped forward. Commander, how is it possible that humanity has experience with these creatures when they only recently emerged from the deep dark? For the first time, Commander Chen's expression showed something like sadness. Admiral, they didn't recently emerge.
They've always been there, waiting in the spaces between stars. The only difference is that the galaxy has grown large enough and confident enough that it stopped believing in the things that hide in the dark. She gestured to something off-screen, and the display shifted to show a star chart unlike any in the Zephyrian databases. It showed the galaxy from a human perspective, with red zones marking areas that their explorers had learned to avoid, safe corridors that their ships followed religiously, and scattered points of light that indicated human outposts maintaining watch over particularly dangerous regions. For 300 years, we've been mapping the dark spaces, Chen continued. Learning where they rest, where they hunt, where they're strongest and where they're weak. We've lost thousands of ships and millions of people learning how to fight them, but we've also learned something else.
What's that? Princess Lyralii asked. They can be beaten.
Not destroyed. I don't think anything can truly destroy something that exists partially outside reality. But they can be driven back, held at bay, kept from the places and people we choose to protect.
All it takes is someone willing to stand watch. The Queen felt something shift in her understanding of the galaxy. The Night Guard.
You're the Night Guard from the old legends.
Commander Chen nodded.
Every species in the galaxy has stories about us, though they call us by different names.
The Altarians know us as the Voidwalkers.
The crystalline hegemony calls us the Boundary Guardians. The Korvaxi have legends of the Star Wardens. Always the same story, strangers who appear when the darkness closes in, who stand between civilization and the things that want to devour it.
But why? The Queen asked. Why take on such a burden?
The human commander's expression softened, and, for a moment she looked not like a warrior who had just faced down cosmic horrors, but like any parent thinking about their children.
Because someone has to.
Because the galaxy is full of incredible civilizations and beautiful worlds and people who deserve to sleep peacefully without knowing what hunts them in the dark. Because we learned long ago that the only way to defeat monsters is to become the thing they fear most.
And what's that?
Commander Chen smiled, and in that smile was the echo of every human who had ever stood watch through a dark night, who had ever told stories around a fire to keep the shadows at bay, who had ever chosen to believe that tomorrow would be better than today. People who refuse to be afraid, she said simply. People who look at something impossible and ancient and terrible, and say not today.
People who understand that hope isn't just an emotion, it's a choice.
And, sometimes, it's the only weapon that matters.
The transmission ended, leaving the bridge of the Eternal Dominion in contemplative silence.
Outside the viewports, the 7 human ships began to move, taking up positions around the Zephyr system in a defensive pattern that would allow them to respond quickly to any new threat. Queen Zerathia looked at her daughter and saw her own thoughts reflected in the princess's expression. The galaxy they thought they knew, the ordered, civilized space where technology and diplomacy solved all problems, was a lie. The real galaxy was a much darker and more dangerous place, where ancient hungers stirred in the void between stars, and the only thing standing between civilization and chaos was a handful of humans who had chosen to be guardians.
Admiral, the Queen said finally, prepare a message to the Galactic Council.
It's time they learned the truth about who's been protecting them all this time. As the Eternal Dominion began broadcasting the recordings of the battle to every system in the network, Princess Lyralii moved to stand beside her mother at the observation deck. Below them, Zephyr Prime turned peacefully in space, its people unaware of how close they had come to extinction.
Mother, the princess said quietly, what happens now?
The Queen was quiet for a long moment, watching the human ships on patrol at the edge of their system.
Now we learn, my daughter. We learn how to be worthy of the protection we've been given.
And, perhaps, if we're brave enough, we learn how to stand watch ourselves. In the depths of space, Commander Sarah Chen looked out at the galaxy she and her people had sworn to protect, knowing that this was only the beginning. The real test was still coming, and, when it arrived, humanity would need all the allies they could find.
Because the galaxy was about to learn that some fears were too ancient and too hungry to be fought by any single species, no matter how determined. But, together, united by the simple refusal to surrender to despair, they might just have a chance. The Night Guard had revealed themselves. Now it was time to see if the rest of the galaxy was ready to stand with them in the dark. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 72 hours after the Battle of Zephyr Prime, as historians would later call it. The Great Amphitheater on Harmony Station, normally a place of measured debate and diplomatic protocol, buzzed with an energy that bordered on panic. Representatives from 47 species filled the circular tiers, their diverse forms united only by the fear that emanated from them like heat from a forge. Queen Zerathia stood at the central podium, the recordings from her flagship's sensors ready for display. Behind her, the great holographic projector that normally showed peaceful star charts and trade routes now waited to reveal the truth that would shatter the galaxy's sense of security forever. Honored delegates, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater's acoustics. 3 days ago, my homeworld was attacked by entities that we now know have been responsible for the disappearances of entire fleets and populations across the Rim territories. What you are about to see will challenge everything we thought we knew about our place in the galaxy. The lights dimmed, and the holographic display came to life, showing the approach of the alien entities toward Zephyr Prime. Across the amphitheater, delegates leaned forward, their various forms of breathing apparatus working harder as stress hormones flooded their systems. Ambassador Kethril of the Eltarian Federation, his crystalline features reflecting the light from the display, was the first to speak. Your Majesty, we've lost contact with 6 more of our outer colonies since this session was called. Whatever these things are, they're not limiting their attacks to Rim worlds anymore. The Korvaxi Empire has begun evacuating our frontier settlements, added General Thaxon, his massive form shifting uncomfortably in his specially designed seat. But, evacuation to where? These entities appear and disappear at will. Nowhere seems safe. Queen Zerathia raised one hand for silence. There is more you need to see. The display shifted to show the arrival of the human vessels, the 7 small ships positioning themselves between the alien entities and the Zephyrian fleet. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the amphitheater. The humans? Professor Vilak of the Academic Consortium voiced what many were thinking. But, they're barely 3 centuries into their space age. What could they possibly do against something that has defeated our most advanced fleets? The Queen let the recordings play without commentary. They watched as the human ships began their strange song, as they projected beams of concentrated starlight, as they stood firm against psychic assaults that had shattered the minds of veteran warriors. They watched as 18 ancient nightmares retreated in defeat before 7 vessels that wouldn't have qualified as patrol boats in most of their fleets. When the display finished, the amphitheater fell silent. It was Ambassador Zelix of the Hegemony who finally spoke, her mental voice resonating in the telepathic frequencies her species used for formal communication. This is impossible. Our analysis of human technology shows nothing that could account for what we just observed. That's because you've been analyzing the wrong technology, came a new voice from the gallery. Every head in the amphitheater turned toward the speaker. A human woman had risen from one of the observer seats normally reserved for species not yet granted full council membership. She was tall by human standards, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths that belied her apparent age. I am Director Elena Vasquez of the Human Colonial Defense Initiative, she said, walking down the steps toward the central floor with a confidence that made several delegates shift uncomfortably. And, it's time you learned about the galaxy you actually live in. Chairman Malax, the ancient Bentharian who had presided over the council for 3 centuries, raised one of his many tentacles for order. Director Vasquez, the observer gallery is not permitted to address the full council without proper recognition and protocol, she finished. Yes, I know. But, protocols were written for a different galaxy, Chairman. A galaxy where the worst threats were pirates and territorial disputes. That galaxy doesn't exist anymore. She reached the central floor and activated her own holographic display, revealing a star chart that none of them had ever seen before. It showed the familiar spiral arms of their galaxy, but overlaid with information that made several delegates gasp in recognition and horror. This is the real map of our galaxy, Director Vasquez announced. Not the sanitized version you see in your trade databases and exploration charts,
but the one my people have been building for 300 years. The map showed void zones, areas of space that appeared empty on standard surveys but pulsed with malevolent energy on the human display. It showed wandering entities, massive forms that moved between star systems along paths that defied conventional physics. It showed dead zones where nothing lived and nothing grew, and, around each one, small symbols that could only be human outposts. For 3 centuries, Vasquez continued, humanity has been standing guard over these places. We've lost over 4 million people learning to fight things that your civilizations refuse to acknowledge exist. We've built a network of watchers and guardians that spans the galaxy because someone had to.
General Faxon's voice boomed across the amphitheater.
This is preposterous.
If such threats existed, our intelligence services would have detected them.
Director Vasquez smiled, but there was no humor in it. General, your intelligence services have detected them.
Repeatedly. But your analysts classified them as sensor ghosts, equipment malfunctions, or isolated incidents. Because the alternative, accepting that there are things in the dark that make war fleets irrelevant, was too terrifying to contemplate. She gestured to the display, highlighting specific incidents. The disappearance of the Korvaxi 4th Fleet in the Procyon Nebula. Officially listed as a navigation accident.
Actually consumed by a void leviathan that we've been tracking for 50 years. The evacuation of the Altarian colony on Kepler 186c.
Officially attributed to seismic instability. Actually abandoned because the planet sits on a dimensional weak point that was starting to bleed nightmare entities into normal space. Ambassador Kethral's crystalline form darkened as he processed the implications. You're saying that humanity has been monitoring and combating these threats for centuries, while the rest of us remained ignorant?
Not just monitoring, Vasquez replied.
Fighting. Dying. Holding the line. Because that's what you do when you find monsters under the bed, you don't pretend they're not there.
You learn how to fight them. She activated another display, showing a timeline that stretched back to humanity's first tentative steps into space. It started with our early exploration vessels. They kept encountering things that shouldn't exist, ships that appeared on sensors but cast no shadows, signals from dead space that drove crews insane, entire star systems that seemed normal from a distance but were actually feeding grounds for entities that existed partially outside our reality. Other species would have retreated, would have marked those areas as off-limits and tried to forget what they'd seen.
Humans did something different. We got curious.
We started studying these entities, learning their patterns, figuring out how to fight them. And we discovered something remarkable.
The timeline showed humanity's expansion into space, but, unlike the standard historical records, this one showed a pattern of deliberate choices.
Human colonies weren't just established for resources or territory, they were positioned to guard dimensional weak points. Human exploration routes didn't just follow the most efficient paths, they were designed to intercept and contain threats before they could reach populated systems. We discovered that these entities, as alien and powerful as they are, have limitations.
They're strongest in the deep dark, weakest near stellar emissions.
They feed on despair and fear, but hope and determination can actually cause them physical pain. They can bend reality to their will, but only in places where no one believes strongly enough that reality should remain stable.
Professor Vilak's multiple eyes focused on the human director with new attention.
You're describing warfare conducted on conceptual battlefields.
Exactly. The weapons that work against these entities aren't energy cannons or kinetic projectiles.
Their belief, hope, determination, the absolute refusal to surrender to despair. And humans, it turns out, are very good at those things.
Director Vasquez's expression softened slightly as she looked around the amphitheater. We didn't ask for this responsibility.
But, when you discover that the galaxy is full of people who deserve protection, and you're the only ones who know how to provide it, what choice do you have? Chairman Malex's tentacles writhed in the pattern that indicated deep thought. If what you say is true, then humanity has been serving as guardians for the entire galactic community without our knowledge or consent.
Without your knowledge, yes. But, with your consent?
Vasquez gestured to the delegates around her. Every time you marked a system as unstable and avoided it, you gave your consent. Every time you dismissed reports of impossible phenomena as sensor malfunctions, you gave your consent. Every time you chose not to look too closely at why certain trade routes were safer when human ships traveled them, you gave your consent. The amphitheater erupted in voices as delegates began arguing among themselves. Some demanded proof of humanity's claims, others insisted that the council should have been informed of such threats, still others wondered how much of their civilization's safety had been dependent on the protection of a species they had barely considered significant. Queen Zerathia stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos.
The time for debate is over. According to our intelligence, the attack on my homeworld was merely a probe. The real invasion is coming, and, when it arrives, none of our traditional defenses will be adequate.
How do you know this? Demanded Ambassador Zelix. Because we've been in contact with the human Night Watch for the past 3 days, Princess Lyralii announced from her position in the Zephyrian delegation.
They've been sharing their knowledge freely, holding nothing back.
And what they've told us is that the entities we faced were scouts from something called a Hunger Fleet, a collection of void spawn that have been dormant for millennia and are now awakening.
Director Vasquez nodded grimly.
Our deep space monitoring stations detected the fleet's awakening 6 months ago.
It's massive, hundreds of entities, some of them larger than space stations.
They're moving slowly, gathering strength as they feed on the fear and despair they're spreading ahead of themselves.
How long do we have? General Faxon asked. At their current rate of approach, approximately 8 standard months until they reach the core systems. But they're not coming in a straight line.
They're moving from system to system, consuming as they go. Every world they devour makes them stronger.
The weight of the revelation settled over the amphitheater like a suffocating blanket.
8 months to prepare for an enemy that had already proven capable of destroying their most powerful fleets with ease.
What do you propose we do?
Chairman Malex asked.
Director Vasquez straightened,
and, for a moment she looked like every human who had ever stood watch through a dark night.
We do what humans have been doing for 3 centuries. We stand together. We refuse to be afraid. We learn to fight monsters.
She activated one final display, showing a galaxy-wide network of defensive positions, training facilities, and coordination centers.
The Human Colonial Defense Initiative is prepared to share everything we've learned about fighting the void spawn. Our technology, our tactics, our knowledge of their weaknesses.
But, you have to understand, this isn't about building bigger weapons or thicker armor. This is about learning to fight with concepts and beliefs as well as ships and soldiers.
And if we refuse, asked Ambassador Kethril.
Then, in 8 months, you'll discover what the galaxy looks like when the Night Guard fails, Vasquez replied simply.
Because we can't hold back a hunger fleet alone.
We've been guardians, but we've never been an army.
For that, we need all of you. Princess Lyralii rose from her seat. The Zephyrian Empire formally requests membership in this alliance.
We've seen what these entities can do, and we've seen what humanity can do to stop them. We choose to stand with the Guardians. One by one, other delegates began to rise.
The Altarian Federation, despite their advanced technology, recognized that their weapons were useless against psychic predators.
The Korvaxi Empire, for all their military might, understood that strength of arms meant nothing against enemies that fed on fear itself. Even the academic consortium, normally more interested in research than warfare, realized that some knowledge was too dangerous to exist unchecked. By the end of the session, 43 of the 47 Council species had agreed to join what would become known as the Galactic Defense Initiative. The remaining 4 would change their minds within days, as reports continued to pour in of entire systems going dark. As the delegates filed out to begin the monumental task of preparing their civilizations for a war unlike any they had ever imagined, Director Vasquez remained on the central floor, staring up at the star map that showed the approaching Hunger Fleet.
Queen Zerathia approached her, Princess Lyralii at her side. Director, may I ask you something? Of course, Your Majesty. Why didn't you reveal yourselves sooner? Why wait until now to tell us about the threats you've been fighting?
Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, her eyes still focused on the distant points of malevolent light moving inexorably toward the galactic core.
Because, Your Majesty, the galaxy wasn't ready.
Your civilizations had grown comfortable, secure in the belief that technology and diplomacy could solve any problem.
You'd forgotten that some fights can't be won with superior firepower or negotiation. And, now? Now you've seen the enemy. You've watched conventional weapons fail. You've witnessed what it looks like when something that feeds on fear meets something that refuses to be afraid. Now you're ready to learn what it really means to stand guard against the dark. As the three women stood in the empty amphitheater, the weight of the galaxy's future pressing down on them, Princess Lyralii asked the question that would define the months to come. How do we teach an entire civilization to fight with hope instead of fear? Director Vasquez smiled, and, for the first time since the crisis began, it was a smile of genuine warmth. Princess, you don't teach a civilization to fight with hope. You show them something worth hoping for, and, then, you stand beside them when the darkness comes calling. Outside the station's viewports, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, beautiful and serene. But, now everyone knew that between those points of light, ancient hungers stirred in the void, growing stronger with each world they consumed. The galaxy had 8 months to learn how to be brave. For humanity, it would be the culmination of 3 centuries of guardianship. For everyone else, it would be a crash course in fighting monsters. The real question wasn't whether they could learn quickly enough. The real question was whether they could learn to believe in themselves, in each other, and, in the simple truth that sometimes the only thing standing between civilization and chaos was the willingness to say no to the dark. Time would tell if the galaxy was ready to become its own night guard. 6 months before the Hunger Fleet would reach the core systems, the first joint training exercise between human Night Watch forces and galactic military units took place in the Vega system. What happened there would be remembered as both the most humbling and most inspiring moment in modern galactic history. Princess Lyralii stood on the observation deck of the training station New Dawn, watching as her hand-picked team of Zephyrian elite guards prepared for their first lesson in conceptual warfare. These were warriors who had distinguished themselves in countless battles, soldiers who had never known defeat. Today, they were about to learn that everything they thought they knew about combat was insufficient. Nervous, asked Commander Sarah Chen, who had been assigned as the primary instructor for the Zephyrian forces. Terrified, Lyralii admitted. My warriors are the finest in our empire, but they're used to fighting enemies they can see and understand. How do you train someone to battle their own despair? Shen smiled, the expression that had become familiar to delegates across the galaxy over the past months. Princess, you don't train them to battle despair. You train them to make despair irrelevant. Come on, you should see this. They made their way to the primary training deck, where 30 Zephyrian soldiers stood in formation facing a simple-looking human instructor. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was unremarkable by most standards, medium height, average build, nothing that would mark him as one of the galaxy's most dangerous warriors. But, Lyralii had seen his file. He had survived 17 direct encounters with void spawn entities, including 3 Leviathan-class contacts that had destroyed entire battle groups. All right, everyone, Webb announced, his voice carrying easily across the training deck. Before we begin, I need you to understand something fundamental about the enemies you're going to face. They don't operate by the same rules as anything you've fought before. He gestured to a holographic display that materialized in the center of the deck. It showed a standard tactical scenario, 2 fleets facing off in open space, with clear objectives and conventional weapons. This is warfare as you know it, Webb continued. Ships with specific capabilities, weapons with defined ranges and effects, tactics based on positioning and firepower. Now forget all of that. The display shifted, showing what appeared to be empty space. Then, gradually, shadows began to move between the stars, shapes that hurt to look at directly, entities that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the 3-dimensional display could properly represent. This is what you're actually fighting. These entities don't just want to destroy you, they want to unmake you. They feed on your fear, your doubt, your certainty that you can't possibly win. Every moment you spend thinking about how hopeless the situation is makes them stronger and you weaker. One of the Zephyrian soldiers, a veteran named Korthak, raised his hand. Lieutenant, with respect, fear is a natural response to superior enemies. How do we simply choose not to feel it? Webb's expression grew serious. Soldier, you don't choose not to feel fear. Fear is information, it tells you when something is dangerous. What you choose is what to do with that fear. Do you let it paralyze you, or do you use it to fuel your determination to protect what matters? He activated another display, this one showing a recording from the Battle of Kepler 442b.
The human colony world was under direct attack by 3 void spawn entities, their nightmare forms descending through the atmosphere like living storms. The colony's defenses, a handful of converted civilian ships and a few hundred volunteers, should have been completely inadequate. Instead, they watched as the colonists fought back with a coordination and determination that defied explanation. Parents stood guard over their children, teachers protected their students, neighbors defended each other with a ferocity that turned civilian vessels into instruments of hope made manifest.
This is Rebecca Martinez, Webb said, highlighting one figure in the recording.
A middle-aged woman was standing on the colony's main platform, holding what appeared to be a simple torch but which blazed with the light of a star. Around her, the void spawn entities recoiled as if her light caused them physical pain.
She's a schoolteacher. No military training, no special equipment.
But, when the darkness came for her students, she stood between them and the void.
And the void blinked first.
The recording continued, showing how the light from the teacher's torch spread to other colonists, how ordinary people became beacons of defiance against cosmic horror. By the battle's end, 3 entities that had consumed entire fleets were retreating in defeat before a community that refused to surrender.
How is that possible? Asked another Zephyrian soldier.
Because, came a new voice from behind them, the universe operates on more than just physical laws. Everyone turned to see Dr. Elena Vasquez approaching, but she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a figure that made several of the Zephyrians step back in instinctive recognition. It was tall, humanoid but clearly not human, with features that seemed to shift between ancient wisdom and terrible knowledge.
This is Keeper Zethmiran, Vasquez announced.
One of the few survivors from the original Void Wars, 5,000 years ago.
The ancient being inclined its head toward the assembled soldiers.
When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond normal hearing. Young warriors, I have lived long enough to see the rise and fall of a dozen galactic civilizations. I have witnessed the birth of stars and the death of hope. And I have learned that the greatest battles are not fought with weapons of metal and energy, but with weapons of spirit and will. Keeper Zethmiran gestured to the holographic display, which shifted to show scenes from the ancient Void Wars.
5 millennia ago, my people stood where you stand now, facing an enemy that seemed invincible, that fed on our fear and grew stronger with each victory. We had technology you can barely imagine, weapons that could reshape reality itself. And we were losing.
The images showed the fall of vast cities, the extinction of entire species, darkness spreading across the galaxy like a plague. We lost because we fought with our minds instead of our hearts. We analyzed the enemy, catalogued their capabilities, tried to find technological solutions to a spiritual problem. It was only when we learned to fight with faith instead of facts that we began to turn the tide.
Lieutenant Webb nodded.
The Keeper has agreed to help train our forces because he understands something that took humanity 3 centuries to learn: the Void Spawn aren't just aliens with advanced technology. They're manifestations of entropy itself, of the universe's tendency toward chaos and dissolution. You can't defeat them with bigger guns or better shields.
Then, how do we defeat them? Princess Lyralii asked.
Keeper Zethmiran's ancient features shifted into what might have been a smile.
Princess, you don't defeat entropy. You defy it.
You stand in the path of dissolution and declare that some things are too important to let fade into darkness. You make yourself into a living affirmation that order, beauty, and hope have meaning. The training deck's lights dimmed, and, suddenly, the assembled soldiers could feel something moving in the shadows at the edge of their vision. Not physical entities, these were psychic constructs, carefully controlled manifestations designed to trigger the same fear response as actual void spawn without the lethal consequences. First lesson, Webb announced as the shadows pressed closer.
Don't fight the fear. Accept it, acknowledge it, then choose what you're going to do with it.
The Zephyrian soldiers responded as they had been trained, forming defensive positions, readying their weapons, preparing to engage the enemy. But their conventional tactics were useless against entities that existed more as concepts than physical forms.
You're thinking like soldiers, Commander Chen called out from the observation platform.
Stop trying to kill them and start trying to banish them. How? Shouted Korthak as one of the shadow constructs loomed over him. Remember why you fight, Webb replied. Not what you fight against, but what you fight for. Slowly, painfully, the Zephyrian soldiers began to understand. Instead of focusing on the threat, they began focusing on what they were protecting. Images of home, of family, of the future they wanted to preserve began to glow faintly around them, not visible to normal sight, but blazing like beacons in the conceptual realm where the void spawn operated.
The shadow constructs recoiled as if burned.
Better, Chen acknowledged.
But, you're still thinking individually.
Void spawn are strongest when they can isolate their targets, make each person feel alone against the darkness.
What happens when you remember you're not alone? Understanding dawned in Princess Lyreliai's eyes.
Link up, she called to her soldiers.
Not just tactically, emotionally. Remember that we all stand for the same things.
The Zephyrians began to move closer together, but not in the physical formations they had been trained to use.
Instead, they formed emotional bonds, sharing their courage, their determination, their absolute refusal to let the darkness win.
The glow around them intensified, becoming a network of light that bound them together and made each individual stronger.
The shadow constructs fled. Excellent, Keeper Zethmiran said approvingly. You begin to understand. The void spawn are the manifestation of cosmic loneliness, the terror that we are all alone in an uncaring universe.
When beings stand together and declare that they are not alone, that they care for each other and will protect what matters, the void spawn lose much of their power.
Over the following weeks, similar training exercises took place across the galaxy.
Altarian crystal singers learned to harmonize not just their voices but their hopes, creating songs that could turn despair into determination. Korvaxi warriors discovered that their legendary battle fury was even more effective when tempered with protective love for their comrades. Academic consortium researchers found that their pursuit of knowledge became a weapon against entities that thrived on ignorance and confusion. But the most remarkable transformation occurred among the human trainees. Director Vasquez stood in her command center on Luna, watching reports come in from training facilities across human space. For 3 centuries, humanity had fought the void spawn in small groups, scattered cells of guardians who had learned their techniques through trial and error. Now, for the first time, they were training together as a unified force. The preliminary reports are extraordinary, reported Colonel James Mitchell, her chief of staff.
Training efficiency is up 400% when human units work alongside galactic allies.
It's as if the act of teaching others is making our own people stronger.
Vasquez nodded thoughtfully.
It makes sense, from a conceptual warfare standpoint.
Hope shared is hope multiplied.
When we protect others, we become more than just guardians, we become symbols of what's worth preserving. On her display, she could see training exercises taking place on dozens of worlds. Human Night Watch veterans working alongside alien soldiers, teaching them not just tactics but the fundamental philosophy that had allowed humanity to stand against the darkness for 3 centuries. In the Vega system, Princess Lyreliai had become one of the most effective conceptual warriors in the galaxy, her natural empathy and royal training in diplomacy translating perfectly to the emotional battlefield where void spawn were fought. Her soldiers, inspired by her example, had developed new techniques that combined Zephyrian crystalline technology with human hope projection methods.
In the Altarian core worlds, entire choirs of crystal singers were learning to weave human battle songs into their traditional harmonies, creating music that could literally reshape local spacetime to favor order over chaos.
Even the warlike Korvaxi had embraced the new paradigm, with their greatest generals declaring that learning to fight for others instead of merely against enemies had awakened strengths they never knew they possessed. But perhaps the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Professor Vilak of the Academic Consortium had been studying the philosophical implications of conceptual warfare when he made a startling discovery.
Director Vasquez, he announced during one of their regular briefings, I believe I understand why humanity was the first to develop effective anti-void techniques. I'm listening, Professor.
The multi-eyed academic activated a display showing comparative cultural analysis of various galactic civilizations. Every spacefaring species develops according to certain patterns. We become more logical, more technologically dependent, more focused on efficiency and optimization.
It's a natural progression that allows for the development of interstellar civilization. But humans are different.
Despite achieving spaceflight capability, you retained what most species would consider primitive characteristics. You still tell stories around fires, still believe in monsters and heroes, still maintain emotional connections to concepts like honor, sacrifice, and selfless love. Other species evolve past these things, but humans cling to them. Vasquez felt a chill of recognition. You're saying our primitiveness was actually an advantage?
More than that. I believe it was essential.
The void spawn exist in the spaces between logic and emotion, between the rational and the irrational. A purely logical civilization has no defense against entities that operate on emotional and conceptual levels. But a civilization that maintains both technological capability and emotional depth, that's something the void spawn can't easily digest.
The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't stumbled into the role of galactic guardians by accident.
They had been uniquely suited for it from the beginning, their refusal to abandon childish concepts like heroism and hope making them the only species capable of fighting an enemy that fed on despair and isolation. As the months of training continued, it became clear that the Alliance was developing into something unprecedented in galactic history. Species that had barely interacted before were forming bonds based not on trade or politics, but on shared determination to protect something precious. The galaxy was learning to stand together. But, in the deep dark between stars, the Hunger Fleet continued its inexorable approach. Hundreds of entities, some large enough to devour moons, moved through space with the patience of geological time and the hunger of entropy itself. They had consumed 17 star systems already, growing stronger with each feeding.
8 months had become 6. Then, 4. Then, 2.
The Academy of Light that had been built in those months would soon face its ultimate test.
The question that haunted everyone's dreams was simple: would hope and determination be enough against hunger that had been growing for millennia?
Director Vasquez stood at her command center, watching the final training exercises and, knowing that ready or not, the galaxy was about to discover what happened when the Night Guard stopped being humanity's secret and became the galaxy's last hope.
The real battle was about to begin.
The Hunger Fleet emerged from the deep void at the edge of the Sol system at 0347 Galactic Standard Time on what would become known as the Day of the Final Dark. The masked defenders of the galaxy, gathered at humanity's birth world for the ultimate confrontation, felt the arrival like a physical blow to their souls. Director Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Eternal Vigilance, the flagship of the combined Galactic Defense Fleet, watching displays that showed contacts beyond anything they had prepared for. The training exercises had been based on encounters with single entities or small groups. What approached them now was a migration of cosmic predators, hundreds of void spawn entities arranged in formations that hurt to perceive directly.
Fleet composition report, she requested, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced.
4,700 ships from 47 species, reported Admiral Chen, Sarah's sister who had taken command of fleet operations. Including the entire human Night Watch fleet, the Zephyrian Grand Armada, the Altarian Crystal ships, and the Korvaxi war hosts.
Total personnel, approximately 38 million souls.
It was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history.
And, looking at the approaching entities, Vasquez wondered if it would be enough.
On Earth below, in the command bunker that had been humanity's secret coordination center for 3 centuries, Queen Zerathia stood beside Princess Lyralii and Keeper Zethmiran. The ancient being had lived through the original Void Wars and had warned them that this confrontation would dwarf anything from that era.
"How long do we have?" the Queen asked.
"The lead entities will reach the outer system in approximately 6 hours, Lieutenant Webb reported from his monitoring station.
"But, Majesty, they're not approaching like we expected. They're not coming directly at Earth." The tactical display shifted to show the Hunger Fleet's movement pattern.
Instead of a direct assault on humanity's homeworld, the entities were spreading out, surrounding the system in a sphere of malevolent presence.
"They're not here to destroy us quickly," Keeper Zethmiran realized, his ancient voice carrying notes of dread. "They're here to feed.
They want to savor our despair, to draw out our fear and consume it slowly." Princess Lyralii stepped forward, her crystalline features reflecting the light from the tactical displays.
"Then, we don't give them what they want." "Princess?" Webb asked.
"They feed on fear and despair, but they're expecting us to feel those things."
"What if we don't?"
She turned to the assembled commanders.
"What if instead of being terrified by the size of their fleet, we're inspired by the size of ours? Director Vasquez felt something shift in her understanding of the battle to come.
You're talking about turning their own tactic against them.
Exactly.
They spread out to maximize our fear, to make us feel surrounded and hopeless. But look at what they've actually done. They've scattered their forces across an entire star system. And we have the largest fleet in galactic history concentrated in one place.
Admiral Chen's voice came through the comm system from the fleet flagship.
All ships, this is Fleet Command.
Princess Lyralii is right. They've given us the tactical advantage by spreading out.
We can defeat them in detail if we coordinate properly. The transformation that occurred across the 38 million defenders in the following minutes would be studied by military historians for centuries. Fear didn't disappear. It was impossible to look at the approaching entities without feeling primal terror. But that fear was transformed, becoming fuel for determination rather than paralysis. On the Altarian crystal ships, the Singer crews began their harmony of hope, voices joining across space in a song that made the vacuum itself ring with defiance. The Korvaxi war hosts responded with their battle prayers, ancient words that turned fury into protection for those they loved. The academic consortium vessels projected probability matrices that proved, mathematically, that courage had statistical advantages over despair. And, at the center of it all, the human Night Watch fleet began to glow. It started with the smallest ships, converted civilian vessels and colony patrol boats that had never been intended for major combat. But these were the ships crewed by veterans of 3 centuries of guardian duty, by people who had stood watch through countless dark nights and never wavered. The light spread from ship to ship, carried not by any physical transmission but by the simple fact that hope shared becomes hope multiplied. Soon the entire human fleet blazed like a constellation of artificial stars, their hulls transformed into beacons that cast back the shadows between worlds. The Hunger Fleet's response was immediate and terrifying. The entities that had been content to approach slowly suddenly accelerated, their nightmare forms twisting through space in patterns that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Their psychic assault preceded them, waves of pure existential terror designed to shatter minds and break spirits before the physical battle began. It crashed against the combined fleet like a tsunami of despair. And was transformed into something else entirely. The Zephyrian ships, their crystalline hulls resonating with the fear waves, didn't absorb the terror, they refracted it, breaking it down into component emotions and reflecting back only the determination to protect. The Altarian crystal singers caught the psychic assault in their harmonies and sang it back as defiance. The Korvaxi warriors felt the fear and channeled it into protective rage for their newfound allies. But it was the humans who performed the miracle that saved them all. Every Night Watch vessel became a lens that focused the terror, accepting it fully and, then, transforming it through the simple alchemy of refusing to surrender. Fear became determination. Despair became hope. Certainty of defeat became absolute refusal to let anything hurt the people they had sworn to protect. The first void spawn entity to reach effective range found itself facing not the broken, terrified prey it expected, but 38 million souls united in the simple declaration that some things were worth fighting for. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded history. Ships fought with weapons of light and songs of hope. Void entities found their reality-warping powers neutralized by crews who believed so strongly in the laws of physics that they became locally immutable. Ancient horrors that had devoured civilizations discovered that their appetite for fear was being starved by people who had learned to feast on courage instead. Princess Lyralii, commanding the Zephyrian flagship Crystal Dawn, found herself at the center of a formation that included ships from a dozen species. As a Leviathan-class entity, something the size of a small moon bore down on them, she felt the familiar chill of mortal terror. And then, she felt something else, the presence of her allies, all of them afraid, all of them determined to stand together anyway. The fear didn't go away, but it became irrelevant. All ships, this is Crystal Dawn, she broadcast. Remember why we fight. Not against the darkness, but for the light. The response came not in words but in action. Every ship in the formation began to glow brighter, their various technologies and techniques combining into something greater than the sum of their parts. The Leviathan struck their formation and recoiled as if it had grasped molten metal. Across the system, similar scenes played out as the Hunger Fleet discovered that their prey had learned to bite back. Entities that had never encountered serious resistance found themselves not just fought but actively driven back by defenders who treated their advance not as inevitable but as unacceptable. On Earth, in the command bunker, Queen Zerathia watched the tactical displays with amazement.
"They're winning." "Not winning," Keeper Zethmiron corrected gently. "They're proving that victory is possible. The real test comes next."
As if summoned by his words, the displays shifted to show something new emerging from the deep dark. It was larger than the Leviathans, older than the galaxy's recorded history, and it radiated hunger that transcended mere physical appetite. This was what the Hunger Fleet had been protecting, keeping in reserve for the moment when the defenders thought they might actually win. It was the Void King, the original hunger, the entropy from which all other void spawn had been spawned. Looking at it was like staring into the heat death of the universe itself. Every ship in the defensive fleet felt its arrival. Fear returned, stronger than before, and this time it threatened to overwhelm even the most determined souls. This wasn't just another enemy, this was the thing that nightmares were afraid of. Director Vasquez felt the psychic pressure like a physical weight, pressing down on her consciousness and whispering that resistance was futile, that everything they had built would eventually crumble into dust and emptiness anyway. And then, she heard a voice on the fleet-wide channel, young and clear and absolutely unafraid. "This is Princess Lyralii to all ships. I know you can feel it too, the certainty that we're about to lose, that everything we've fought for doesn't matter in the face of something so ancient and powerful." The princess paused, and, in that pause, millions of people across the fleet held their breath. "But, here's what I know about that thing. It's hungry. It's always been hungry. And the only way it can feed is if we give up, if we decide that our hopes and dreams and love for each other aren't worth defending." Her voice grew stronger, carried not just by technology but by the conviction of someone who had seen the darkness and chosen light anyway. "So here's what we're going to do. We're going to remember every good thing we've ever experienced. Every moment of joy, every act of kindness, every time someone chose to help instead of hurt. We're going to remember that the universe isn't just entropy and emptiness, it's also full of people who care about each other." Across the fleet, something began to happen. The light that had dimmed in the face of ultimate darkness began to return, but it was different now. Instead of the bright defiance they had shown before, this was the steady, warm glow of people who had found something worth protecting and were willing to stand guard over it forever. The Void King's advance slowed. And, most importantly,